for a first shlema of Moshe Aaron ben Sarah and Faya Gittel bat Manya, and any other cholim, may they have a speedy refuah shlema. Okay, so continuing with the theme of Hillel Hashem, we nearly actually finished here. Last paragraph. The Rambam presents a novel definition of the concepts of sanctification and desecration of Hashem's name by quoting Devarim, chapter 28, verse 9. Go in his ways. So, since all of our actions emulate the acts of Hashem, so long as we are doing that which is good and upright, we are sanctifying his great name. Whenever we do not behave appropriately and commit transgressions, we commit a Chilul Hashem. An upright person who conducts himself appropriately is deemed to be emulating Hashem and thus faithfully fulfills his purpose for being, having been created in Hashem's image. However, if, heaven forbid, a person doesn't conduct himself suitably, and as such is not going in the ways of Hashem, he has failed in his principal role. We need to realize that as Jews, and especially as observant Jews, we have a significant responsibility. Many have great expectations of us, particularly in the way we treat others. Expectations and perceptions are critical in determining the magnitude of the sanctification or desecration of Hashem's name. Each individual has ample opportunity to sanctify Hashem's name each day by demonstrating integrity, respect, and decency in interactions with others. If chatz v'chalila, we do not do so, it is quite likely that we cause Chilul Hashem, a sin that eludes atonement and only is atoned at death.
What do you mean only tone deaf? I'm tone.
Atoned. Only so Yom Kippur doesn't. It only gets remedied at death.
I think Damon must go for a hearing.
Yeah.
He thought you said tone deaf as opposed to atoned at death.
Atoned, yeah. We said it quickly. Okay.
You said
Give him the benefit
correctly,
of the doubt. Oh, did you hear correctly?
Yeah, but no, it's tricky. If you say it fast enough, it sounds like either or.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? Whoever thought that atoning for death would be a laughing matter?
Yeah. Sure.
In our share, do we new break new boundaries? All right. So, please God, Hashem will bless us this year that we finish Bava Kamma and that we remember Bava Kamma and we can give over Bava Kamma. Amen. So, guys, you remember what we dealt with last time is that basically last year, all the way back last year, we dealt with the fact in which it doesn't make sense to damage a slave or a married woman, because either way, it's not them. A slave doesn't have assets, and a woman that's married doesn't have assets of her own in order to distribute to those she's injured, unless there's certainly very special circumstances and certain conditions. But if you injure them, you have to pay. You're not immune. So it's either way, it's bad all round for you. So there's going to be quite a few comparisons in the dafs between married women and slaves. Generally, in a marriage, the men are the slaves. But yeah, we're now on a different section. We're dealing with the fact of, so far, guys, we've discussed a case where a married woman injured somebody else. The Gemara now discusses a realistic case in which the injured party was the husband. No, not just emotionally, but in this case, physically. All right. So, concerning that which was taught in a brisa, now, just before we do this, I think it is customary, because we finished the year, to give a 2-minute summary on the last stuff. So, to summarize, if a married woman injures someone, we don't force her to sell her basic ketubah. In other words, the right to collect the 200 zuz if she's a virgin, or the 100 zuz if she's a non-virgin, and give the sale of the money to a victim. because she will invariably turn around and forgive this amount to her husband, and the court will then have caused a financial loss to the buyer. Furthermore, guys, we don't even force her to sign the rights of collection of this sum to the victim itself, because this is an exercise in futility. Since forgiving her husband of the ketubah, in other words, all she has to do is forgive him of the amount owed to her by the husband. That's a foregone conclusion because she doesn't want marital issues. So you're wasting the court's time. Now we say, but if the woman owns Malog property or Tzon Bazel property, Malog, remember, is not actually written into the ketubah. It's either property she had before she got married and wasn't officially written into the ketubah. The husband uses the usufruct, but she owns the title deed, or the Tzon Bazel property, at which it is written in the ketubah, but it's fixed at that value at the time of the ketubah, whether it accrues additional value or decreases in value. That value is set at the time because it's her property. So in that particular case, in the event of the husband divorcing her, he has to give her back that money. And in the event of death, his estate has to give her back that money. In terms of, does he own the title deed compared to Malog property? I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that it might be a similar arrangement to the Malog. But if he actually has to physically pay her back, then I'm sure the title deed gets transferred to him. Perhaps it's a community and property title deed where they both own the title deed and they both get the usufruct. But if he is paying her back, then I'm sure the title deed gets transferred to her. Malog property is also property that she might have got after the contractual tuba concluded, and maybe they'd be married 10 years and one of her parents died and left her property. She was either gifted or inherited it. And in that case, if she injured a victim, whether there's Malog property or Tzon Bazel, she can be made to sell that property and use that money to pay off the victim. But of course, she can't sell the property at its full value because there's that enactment of Usha, which is a place where one of the 10 places where the Sanhedrin intervened, which means it's going to leave the husband in a predicament. So in order to not even possibly risk any sort of usufruct variant, because you could say, well, can't she sell her property and like a father can to the son, and then the father have the usufruct and the son own the title deed? And we say no, because of the fact that, especially according to Rabbi Meir, there had to be some deterrent that he wouldn't divorce her. So if he owes a fortune of money, when he divorces her, he's not going to get divorced so quickly. So that enactment of Usha is also to protect her as well as him. But that means that she has to sell the property to a buyer in order to make sure that the victim gets paid a discounted, she gets a discounted amount. Why? Because there's certain conditions. The prospective buyer can only collect on the event that the husband predeceases his wife, at which case she doesn't collect it from the estate. He does, the buyer, and that, or if the couple gets divorced, the husband would have to pay it to the buyer who owns the title deed or the ketubah, and not the wife. But it doesn't affect the husband, because the enactment of Usha says that at the end of the day, the husband's got to be well out the picture, either through death or divorce, and therefore it doesn't affect the marriage because it doesn't affect him adversely at all. But for somebody to pay for such a right, it means it's discounted because the probability is it might not happen. So the guidance was it's about 10%. She might be able to get more. But if you remember, there was an issue that Gavin brought up, which was quite good, is that she might not be able to honor that, because it's one thing if she sells that property and she's getting the proceeds, even if it's 10 or 20%, she's probably not going to go back on her word, because the court's going to say, but you benefited. But to pay a third party and be left without any sort of money from her husband through death or divorce, she's not going to go through with it. She's going to almost rather forgive the husband of that money to then give it to some stranger. So what happens is, to sell the prop. So what emerges from a sugya is basically that it's going to be very difficult to get a woman to do that. So basically, the malok property of a wife is mortgaged to her husband for produce and inheritance. So obviously that impression given by that statement is that a woman who has malok property need not pay a victim. But it seems in contradiction with the Gemara, because there are other opinions that say anybody with malok property has no significant amount of money to pay their victims, meaning they pay them the discounted amount, but not what their victim was hoping to get, especially if that money was for the injury should have been far more. There are other opinions that say there's a categorically that that women that are married are exempt and never compensate their victims. So as usual, there's two different opinions, but there's no reason why the court can't make her honor that agreement to the purchaser and not just forgive her husband of the debt, because if a person's paid and it's under contract that she gotten money, she can't defraud him either. Okay, so that was a case of a stranger. Now, what happens if her husband injures her? Okay, so what happens is, it was taught in a brisa, likewise, if she wounded her husband, she doesn't forfeit her ketubah. She's not made to surrender her ketubah, guys, to her husband in order to reimburse him for the injury. Why is that so? Because the Gemara is saying, let her sell or sign her ketubah at the discounted rate to her husband for this injury. If she forgives the ketubah to her husband, there's no loss to anybody. In other words, we just concluded that a woman is not really required to sell a ketubah to pay for an injury she inflicted upon another person, because we're going to assume that she will forgive the ketubah to her husband and then cause the buyer loss. We also further concluded, guys, that she's not required to assign a ketubah to the victim himself, where there's no risk of causing a loss, even because he's going to gain anything. He's not going to gain anything either way, because we're saying it's going to waste the court's time. She's definitely going to forgive the ketubah to her husband. So it's a pointless exercise and a waste of the court's time. But it's different here, because if the victim is her husband and she assigns the ketubah to him, neither of those two concerns exist. Number one, the assignment poses no risk of financial loss to anybody, because in fact, the husband doesn't have to pay out. He's just saving having to pay her. And number two, it's purposeful. And in fact, basically such an assignment means that the husband won't need to pay the ketubah in the event it becomes due, since the payee of the ketubah would then be the husband himself. So you've got to figure out, why does the brisa say this is not allowed? Guys, anybody got an idea?
Yeah, because it doesn't protect her. Because he's got nothing to pay her, so it's easy for him to get divorced. It's not going to cost him anything.
Exactly. Gavin started the year coming out the gates at a very fast speed, and basically it's according to Rabbi Meir, exactly as Gavin says, who said that it's forbidden for a man to keep his wife even for 1 hour without a ketubah. She can't waive her rights to the ketubah to pay for the injury, for the very simple reason is, if she gives up the rights to the ketubah to her husband, she's certainly going to lose the deterrent against him divorcing her. So it's obviously unlikely. It's unlikely when she does it to a third party. Why, Gavin?
Unlikely. Sorry, I didn't actually hear that last part. Unlikely.
The previous Gemara says when you injure somebody else,
yes,
you can't use Rabbi Meir's deterrent. Why not?
Well, there's no risk of that happening with the third party.
Why?
Because the third party owns that the third party's got the husband doesn't only has the usage of that property.
No.
He doesn't actually own. What,
No, that's no, just hang on. I'm not saying you're wrong. In
okay,
terms of
I might be
facts. I'm
getting.
saying
Yeah.
the logic. You did have the logic. So what I think you're trying to say is as follows, is that when she sells it to a buyer and the buyer's got a title deed, it's still a deterrent, because whether he pays his wife out the ketubah or the purchaser that has the ketubah, either way is paying through the nose. So therefore, it's still a deterrent for him to divorce her. Whereas if she forgoes that money to her husband, he's not paying any third party, so he's definitely got no deterrent to divorce her. Especially if she injured him. He's not too fond of her at that point, and it's not going to cost him to divorce her. So this way, Rabbi Meir's reason really does kick in. Okay. So the Gemara objects because it says, hang on, what's the reason for Rabbi Meir's ruling? It's so that one's wife should not be easy in his eyes to divorce. But here, even if the woman does not give her husband the ketubah, he can divorce her if he wants and collect the ketubah from her injury. Meaning once she's become liable to him legally for having injured him, the ketubah no longer serves as a deterrent, because the husband knows that if he divorces her and becomes liable to pay the ketubah money, he can simply withhold that money in payment for the injury. Because remember, what happens is if somebody owes you money, like a creditor for a damager, can kidnap their tomahawks and withhold it for payment. Possession is 9/10 of the law. He's the one that owns the property. He can say, no, listen, I'm taking off all the medical bills. You can have the rest. He's actually got control. There's very little she can do. So he can withhold that money for payment in lieu of the injury, whatever that part is. So it's not possible to say that the woman is not required to assign him a ketubah because of Rabbi Meir's rule. In any case, a ketubah no longer serves as a deterrent. You get what the issue is.
Yeah.
So it says, if it's because we're concerned about a possible divorce, even if she doesn't give him the ketubah, he can divorce her and collect the ketubah from her injury. So what harm then is there to require her to give her ketubah to her husband as compensation for the injury? Okay, so the Gemara says, look, the Bryce is referring to a case in which her ketubah settlement is great, so that for the small amount of injury compensation, he won't want to lose a large amount. Because it's saying at the present time, the Gemara is assuming that the husband had committed himself to a supplementary ketubah. Remember, we said the romance was there. She was still a virgin, and he was head over heels in love. Not only did he promise her 200 zuz, but he figured, what a woman, and then basically said, apart from the ikka ketubah, the basic ketubah is going to give her a supplementary amount, so that she'll really be lured. So that's some in excess of the statutory 200 zuz. So if the amount, for example, was quite small for the injury in comparison to having bought her a house in Santon or Melrose Arch, and she just broke his toe, he's still not going to want to get a divorce from her, because he's going to lose far more by having to pay the ketubah. So it's the ketubah now is still a deterrent. So the Gemara is persisting. It says, hang on a second. If a ketubah is greater than a biblical ketubah, what's biblical? It means it's just the required amount, without property put in, just 100 or 200 zuz. We should establish her at the amount of a biblical ketubah, and the rest let her sell it to him for his injury. In other words, if the husband committed himself to a ketubah larger than the statutory amount required by the Torah, the wife should have to surrender to him her rights to that excess at a discount to pay for the injury. Okay, so the statutory amount will remain as a deterrent, and that would satisfy Rabbi Meir against him divorcing her. But the Brisa says she doesn't have to lose a ketubah to pay for the injury. So it's saying you don't have to. Why don't we just make that supplementary amount go away in lieu of injury? And then the ketubah stays there, so the deterrent is there. Rabbi Meir is happy. So the Gemara says, look, we're dealing with a different case here. That's obvious. You don't even have to state the obvious, in which her ketubah is not greater than a biblical ketubah. In other words, the amount of the injury is even less. For example, where the amount due to him for the injury may be, as the Gemara says, is 4 zuzim. So because of the gain of 4 zuzim, he won't want to lose out on 25 sulaim, which is 100 zuz, to pay for a ketubah. So it's saying, look, the Gemara basically, guys, is giving an example that the threat of a payment is still hanging over him because that deterrent is still there if the injury is smaller than the payout. Okay? So the divorce is still going to cost her husband a tardy sum. So we're saying, okay, so according to some Rishonim, maybe they might say the injury is large. So although the husband will still have to pay something in the event that he divorces her, the amount would be small compared to the original ketubah obligation. And in that case, she would have to assign the ketubah to her husband for the damage, since anyway there's no significant deterrent. And other Rishonim don't hold like that. They say, look, as long as the amount of the damage is less than the ketubah amount, so that at least there's some financial consequence to the husband if he divorces his wife, and the math doesn't work so good for him, she can't be forced to assign the ketubah to him and destroy that deterrent. But whatever the case, the Gemara definitely concludes, okay, that the amount of damage is equal, if it's equal or greater to the basic ketubah, we do force the woman to assign a ketubah to her husband, since anyway there's no deterrent to divorce. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so you might ask, okay, true. So if the damage is equal to the ketubah, there's in any case no deterrent to divorce. But there also seems to be no benefit to the husband in having the ketubah assigned to him. Let me just give you an example. You take the case in which the ketubah is 100 zuz. She's not a virgin. She was married before, and the damage is also 100 zuz. So why would the husband want the ketubah assigned to him? He doesn't receive any cash by having the ketubah assigned to him. His only gain is that he won't have to pay the ketubah should it come due. But even without that assignment, he won't have to pay the ketubah, since the ketubah and the amount of damage owed to him will cancel each other out. But guys, you've got to realize the question is a mistake, because the ketubah will be assigned to him only at its discounted value. Okay, that's what you've got to bear in mind, which is the value of chance that the ketubah will eventually become collectible. For if you take 100 zuz ketubah, say that she's got people here around the block that their relationship isn't so solid, so she doesn't collect 10%, but she can get a cool 25%, and the assignment is made, the wife will be considered to having paid him only 25 zuz for 100 zuz damage. So she'll still owe him 100 zuz. So if he subsequently divorces her, then besides being exempt from paying her the ketubah, since it was already assigned to him, he now has the opportunity to collect another 75 zuz should she subsequently obtain money through working or other means. So the thing of it is a little bit of a complicated case. Tosfos said, look, the prohibition of remaining with one's wife at the end of the day without having the minimum financial deterrent doesn't apply where the lack of such a deterrent is the wife's own fault. Now, that's a very important concept, okay? Very important. So if she's to blame for the loss of reduction in the deterrent, she's the one that injured him. He might remain married to her, it's his choice, but the court won't do anything to reduce the deterrent, even though she's at fault. In other words, they won't force her to assign a basic ketubah to her husband to pay for it, but he still might not want to be married to her. That's the bottom line. So the Gemara persists and they said, look, how do you explain that which was taught at the end of the same brisa? Just as she can't sell her ketubah while she's married to her husband, so she doesn't forfeit her ketubah while she's married to him. Okay? In other words, the Gemara presently understands that to mean that just as a married woman is unable to sell a ketubah completely, in other words, guys, it's a conditional sale, as you know, meaning that the buyer is entitled to collect even if she dies first. That would be an unconditional. It's not the case. She can't be forced to give up any part of her ketubah in this particular case, unless her husband dies first or divorces her. But then she's doing it of her own volition, but not for an injury or damages that she inflicted. So it's basically saying, well, if that's the case, well, what do we do in his particular case, the husband? At times she's found to have forfeit the ketubah to pay for an injury. And what's the case? Where she injured her husband and the ketubah is greater than the biblical ketubah, which means if the woman possesses a supplementary ketubah, she would have to sell that portion of ketubah to pay for an injury inflicted upon her husband, because there's still a deterrent, because even if that's paid, he still won't want to lose 200 zuz apart from the property. So the Brisa, it's asking, how can the Brisa indicate that the woman never loses her ketubah to pay for an injury? Because we're saying if there is a supplementary ketubah, of course, you might not get rid of the basic or essential ketubah, but certainly the supplementary. So the Gemara restructures the answer. It says, Rava said in the latter case of the Brisa, we have come to a case of a ketubah of male children. What does that mean? Is that it's not discussing the same topic as the first case. It's discussing a new case. It's discussing the ketubah of male children. In other words, who's set to inherit. Let me just explain what it means. Because if you look there's a Mishnah in Ketubot in 52b that says the ketubah of male children dictates that if a wife predeceases her husband, her surviving children are entitled to collect her ketubah, the statutory section plus any additional amount in the tzon bazal property from a husband's estate upon his death. So the children are not robbing the husband. It wasn't the first case of Rava bar Abba. This is a case where the husband also died. Now, who gets the property from the husband's estate upon death? Because there is from a subsequent marriage. Okay. So in other words, the stipulation concerns a married man to two women. Okay. In those days, a married man could be married to two women simultaneously, but there were certain other periods after the Gemara, I think about 1,500 years ago, that you could only have one woman at a time. So these are the two cases. One wife has a larger ketubah than the other. In other words, she came into the marriage and she was wealthier. So that was the first wife. He got divorced from her. Then the second wife had a smaller amount of a ketubah. So let's not talk about when people get married simultaneously. Let's talk about modern case. First wife, second wife. So if both wives die in the husband's lifetime and he inherits both ketubahs, the stipulation requires that the respective ketubahs remain intact for the wife's male children. So like when the husband later dies, his heirs first take the ketubah of their respective mothers and only then divide the rest of the estate equally. Okay? So it results in the children of the mother with a larger ketubah receiving a larger share of the father's estate than the children of the mother with a smaller ketubah. So let me give you an example. There's something called shared income and respective income. So if the first wife's ketubah, she bought property in the marriage, and at that stage, he promised her more. She was a virgin. She bought a bit of property, etc. So that was 1,000 zuz. And the second wife, he was already broke, paying for all his kids. And the first wife died, and she was second time round, so it wasn't a virgin. So she might have paid 100 zuz, and he didn't have stars in his house, so there was no supplementary amount or whatever the case may be. And the second wife had an estate of 200 zuz. And at his death, the husband owned 2,000 zuz. So in other words, 1,000 zuz belonged to his first wife. 200 zuz to the second wife, he has 2,000. So of his own estate, he had a further 800 zuz. So the first wife's sons take 1,000 zuz, because that's in the ketubah to the original wife. And the second son's wives take the 200 zuz, because that's what the second wife was owed. Now, the rest of the estate that belongs to the late father is equally divided amongst both groups. So the first wife's sons emerge with the 1,000 plus the 400 is 1,400 zuz, and the second wife with 200 zuz, the male children, plus the 400 zuz, because remember he had 800. So that 800 got split 400, 400. 1,400 is 1,400, 200 zuz plus 400, 600. So the sizes of the ketubah are the same, but one wife died before the husband and the other died afterwards. And in that case, guys, the sons of the wife who died second can't argue that there's all this money in the estate and that they're entitled to collect their mother's ketubah because she was widowed second and therefore owned everything. Nor could they turn around and say, well, let's split it in the middle. And the sons of the first wives who died can't take their mother's ketubah because it was never owed to her. So we've got to wait for the father to have died. That was the whole argument 2 dafs ago, is that the son couldn't be gifted that by the mother when the second husband was still alive. Do you get what I'm saying? So again, the children, the male heirs, could only get it when their mothers had died and then their father had died, and respectively the ketubahs are drawn up. And the balance of the estate that goes to the father is split between those. But each respective mother, what was in her estate and owing in her ketubah is paid to those male children. Does that make sense, guys? It's pretty easy.
Yeah, that does.
Okay, so it says, just as a woman who sells her ketubah to others does not lose the ketubah of the male children, meaning that yes, why? Because it was money. In other words, it was financial reasons that forced her to make the sale. So to a woman who sells her ketubah to her husband doesn't lose the ketubah of the male children. What's the reason? Because she did it for money. In other words, I'm hearing a lot of background shuffling. Just give me a sec, guys.
It is me. I apologize. It won't happen. It will stop now.
Problem. So if the woman sells her ketubah for a discounted amount to another person and she dies first, allowing her husband to inherit the ketubah and the buyer to suffer loss, her sons can still collect. The only problem is if the husband dies first, they get divorced. Then she has to honor obligation. It's a conditional sale. So the children don't lose out, guys. And it's the same thing if she sells that discounted in order to pay her husband for the injury. If she dies first and predeceases her husband, the children are protected. Cool, guys. I hope I explained it well.
Very well. I wish that was still in force today. I would be a rich man.
We would check if you poisoned them. All right.
What's that?
No, nothing.
I didn't actually hear you. No, sorry, I didn't hear that at all.
All right. Cheers, guys.